Welcome to the Shaman Stories podcast. Today, with me, I have Merlin. Welcome, Merlin. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for having me.
So, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what you do today and your practices?
Yeah, so I am a classical astrologer as well as a ritual magician. I'm trained in classical astrology, specifically working with Hellenistic and ancient Greek texts primarily. And I also read and translate ancient Greek as well as some Sanskrit when it's called for. And additionally, on top of the astrology, I also do a lot of more practical, esoteric. I work in a lot of different practical, esoteric traditions too that used to be very much intertwined with the discipline of astrology. So, for a lot of people now, it's like if you practice astrology, you don't necessarily do anything else, or you don't do anything to explicitly bridge reading horoscopes and looking at charts with more practical things like meditation and, of course, ritual magic and theurgy. But historically, these were all intertwined. If you were an astrologer, then oftentimes you were doing ritual magic too. One of the biggest schools for astrology, the Neoplatonist school, had some of our best astrologers come out of that school, like Porphyry, but then also one of the most famous ritual magicians from the ancient world, Iamblichus, who wrote on the mysteries or on theurgy, is also from that school too. So there's always a lot of overlap between these different disciplines. And what I see a lot of my work is doing is, teaching and practicing astrology in tandem with other, more practical, grounded approaches. And especially ritual magic, also meditation and spiritual practice. I've spent a lot of time exploring and receiving initiations in other traditions too, outside of the kind of Western esoteric astrological tradition, especially the Taoist tradition, where they do have something like astrology and they have other similar kinds of approaches where you're looking at people's time and place of birth, like something called the Bazi charts, and using that to see, what kinds of practices are going to be good for people, what people's elemental and constitution is like, seeing, and even, using that within a medical aspect as well. So, in other traditions where they use astrology or something very similar to astrology, they're always blending that with other more like with more practical things too. And the idea is, by that astrology or something like that is one of the biggest major tools within the toolkit of the shaman, of the spiritual practitioner, of the mage. I think in terms of I really like the metaphor or like the frame of the three worlds, the upper, the middle, the lower. And astrology, horoscopic astrology, reading charts is all very much centered in the upper world for sure. It's operating in the realms of the heavens and using timing to understand what's going to be going on around you and how that's going to trickle out into the middle world and into the lower world. But in order for it to really, I think, transform people's lives and give people the change that they're looking for, it needs to be reintegrated with, the practices of the middle and the lower world too. One of the biggest ways to do this is with like medical astrology and, looking at people's natal charts to see where different imbalances lie and prescribing different herbs and different, even medical procedures at times on the basis of that. And also, of course, through ritual magic, where you're not just, uh, looking at the positions of planets in a natal chart, but you're actually, starting to do ceremonies to talk to the plants directly. And that, for me, for many of my students, has been a real game changer as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in digging a little more into the details of that for sure. Astrology for me has always been one of the things I've been interested in. And I
Mhm.
actually took your class, Gnosis, and it was
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
I
gnosis.
have a hard time logically wrapping my head around the concepts of it, and we'll get into that in a little
Sure.
bit. But, first I wanna go with this podcast, I like to talk about where people came from and how they got to the place they're
Mhm.
at, the journey that they took. So, what was life like for a young Merlin in the beginning?
Yeah, so I wasn't raised around any of this stuff growing up. I was raised in a fairly conservative Christian household where many of these kinds of practices were taboo. And so it was a kind of it took me some time to extricate myself from that and move into where I really felt my heart was calling me to be. You know, I think like many people who grew up in a non-spiritually open household, whether it's conservative Christianity or a different conservative religion or even atheism maybe, like many people like who grow up in those kinds of households experience something when they're younger, some like kind of call where they get exposure to the other world in some way. Maybe they read something in an article or they see a book and they feel something inside of them light up, and they can't necessarily explain where that's coming from or what that really means, but once it lights up, it's kinda hard to shut down, and I had an experience like that when I was 12, and where I started kinda sneaking off in bookstores and, was finding myself always being drawn to, like, esoteric sections and the new age section, the metaphysical section, and I couldn't get enough of, reading these books, and then I would go onto the computer and look stuff up, and I started, my first consistent, meditation practice around that time. It's because I had felt very, very deeply in my bones that, there was something more to the world of spirit than I was just getting within, conservative Christianity. And it almost as if like the ontology that the philosophy that tradition gives you was incomplete in some way, and not that it didn't have things to offer, especially for in terms of like virtues and ethics that were really really good and useful, but it's just extraordinarily limited. And, I had a big push and pull throughout middle school and high school at trying to find out, how to feed this part of myself, that felt like there's so much more to the world than what is described within the Bible. And at the same time trying to maintain the good things that I saw within Christianity and, even consider myself a Christian to a certain extent. And that created a lot of trying to, unify those or blend those to create a lot of mental intention, a lot of emotional strain. I, it w you know, I battled depression and anxiety quite a bit, and, outside of college, I went to after high school, I went to a Christian college, and, I was so miserable there. I couldn't stand it. I would buy books online from Amazon about different, ritual magic practices and theurgy and occult sciences and this kind of stuff, and then I would hide them in my dressers so that nobody would see them. I would take them out when nobody was around and just read them. And it eventually, I got so miserable, I got so frustrated, I got so depressed that I ended up I ended up going into an inpatient facility for about 2 weeks, because my therapist at the time was very, very concerned about me, uh, being a danger to myself. 'Cause I was so miserable, and, then I just, when I was in there, I just realized this is kind of my rock bottom, that I needed to just let that any kind of Christian frame go. Just recognize that's not what I want. It's not what I care about. And I needed to just accept that I liked the things that I liked and that I wanted to study the things that I wanted to study, and that the conservative Christian sphere was not for me. So, moving forward from that, I just my life slowly started to improve. My mood got better. I was kicked out of that school. It's a long story. They didn't like me just as much as I didn't like them, and I ended up going to the University of Pittsburgh, which is a little bit closer to home in Pennsylvania, and found a lot more people that are interested in the kinds of things that I was interested in, found people to talk to, found community. I had been put on a crazy cocktail of of antidepressants, two antidepressants and a mood stabilizer. And then I went to an alternative health practitioner, and he gave me rhodiola, rehmannia, and an omega-3 supplement. And within like a week of taking those, I felt a million times better than I ever did with the antidepressants, and I just quit them cold turkey. And that was this was all kind of on an astrological angle, aligning with a fairly difficult transit that I was going through from Saturn. And it was around the time that that transit finished up where my mood really, really started to lighten, and the supplements that I was doing were taking their effect. The consistent meditation, spiritual practices I were doing are really starting to change me from the inside out and get me in touch with this world that I so desperately wanted to experience. There's a lot of I think you perhaps one of the saddest things about the conservative Christian worldview. It's very similar to the scientific worldview. In many ways, it's very impoverished. There's like the beauty of the spiritual world and all of the spirits that are encountered there, all of the different magical traditions and approaches, and all the different kinds of things that you can experience and the kinds of things you can do with your own energy when you're skilled enough that you just don't have access to in that framework. And I so desperately knew it was true. I wanted to experience that world. What I call in my one class the enchanted world, the world of spirit that is our birthright. I so desperately wanted to be a part of that. And once I had stabilized my spiritual practices enough that I felt like I had entered into it, then so much started to turn around for me in my life. I felt like I really discovered who I am and what I actually care about. And I felt like I had kind of entered into something more what life was supposed to be like, essentially. And I've just been continuing with my practices ever since, and ended up teaching. And I've just been teaching now for about I think I first started teaching about 6 7 years ago, and that's just kind of taken off.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting with the Christianity type viewpoint, and there's nothing wrong with that, but if people were actually to look back further, they had a lot more ritual type magical practices, things that we would call magic rituals today. And there's so much like saint magic where you can call in the saints and do magic with them and have them work with you. I was even at a wake, a friend of the family passed away, and we went to her memorial. And at the church, he's opening the four directions. Like he's calling in, to the east, to the west, to the north, like not directly like we do in the shamanic realm, but he's opening the four directions. But then it
Hmm.
it it twists and it changed into like a more almost kind of like that scientific approach where it's like, okay, now we're doing this, and it just kind of like diffused the whole ritual. From my perspective, I'm like, oh, we're doing a ritual now. This is kind of cool. And I'm feeling the
Yeah.
energy, and then it shifts, and like all the energy just went away.
Hmm.
I was like, well, that's
Hmm.
interesting. And it was like, if you would have just kept going just a little bit more, or just tweaked it just a little bit, we could have had, all the saints in here, or all more magic going on, and actually done an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And it just
Yeah.
it was interesting to see it just kind of just I feel the energy just die basically the minute the shifting happened. It was for me, it was very interesting. And so
Yeah. I mean,
oh, go ahead.
well, I think it's, I mean, I just, yeah, comment piggybacking off of that, how I think it's endlessly fascinating to me how, with enough skill and enough practice cultivated, you can notice things like that.
Mhm.
And there's almost like a black and white method or manner in which the energy behaves, and you can tell very clearly when the technology is working and when it's not. Um, it just shows how real this stuff really is. And I completely agree with you about the how a lot of the magic was divorced from the original Christian tradition. They've retained or done their best, kind or unintentionally retained a lot of it within Catholicism, and even the actual technology that they use around enlivening the host within communion is not too different from an astrological magical ritual of bringing energy from the heavens down into a material thing. It's just they like either don't know what they're doing, or They're just not thinking of it in that way. I mean, if you put your hands together and you pray to a saint and you have incense lit that's specifically associated with the saint and you have a candle that's associated with the saint, that's magic. That's ritual magic. It's no different. Um, and even in the I have a friend of mine who is a Catholic priest who is very, very open to the esoteric stuff. Like he's, in addition to being a very dedicated Thomist, has read a lot of Thomas Aquinas. He also has read the Picatrix. He's read Bonatti. He's read lots of the esoteric texts, read the Hermetica. And he said that in the papal apartments, in the dormitories of the Pope in the Vatican, there is a painting of Moses and Hermes Trismegistus, both sitting together, receiving teachings from Isis, the god, the Egyptian goddess of the moon and the earth. And this idea that's it's hidden there, hidden in plain sight in the papal apartments, that Christianity and Hermeticism, or Hermeticism being, astrology, ritual magic, and herbalism and alchemy, that they have the same source. I think implicit in that painting is sourced within the earth. And It's just they're two different branches. They're an exoteric approach and then an esoteric approach, but they come from the same place.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it's yeah, I mean, we could go down that rabbit trail all day too, because it's
Yeah.
so much symbolism, synchronicities that they all have, but for some reason over time, they veered away from it because they don't wanna seem mystical, I guess, or magical. I'm not sure the real reason for it. I'm just kinda throwing out my own idea, but they just kinda
Yeah, I
broke off from it.
I don't know either. I mean, I have some suspicions, some of the, gradient levels of tinfoil around the head as they, depending on what day you talk to me about it. But I think, a lot of it, yeah, a lot is rooted within the Protestant Reformation and this desire to, it was almost like an iconoclastic uh just movement, is just to kind of purge everything and kind of turn Christianity into, it's not unlike the kind of approach that Zen Buddhism took to more esoteric approaches to Buddhism, whereas like cut the bullshit, let's get right down to basics, like let's get to the essentials, let's get to what really matters. And there's some pros to doing it that way, but especially as we've seen within a lot of Christianity and a lot of Christian movements, there's a lot of cons that can come out when you really you can often end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and I think that's happened with Christianity for the most part.
So with, the way you grew up and moving into this direction, did you have like a break with your parents? Are they accepting of you? Like, what was that shift like?
I think I'm very blessed because they I didn't ever have a break with them. Um, it's been is I've had similar conversations with them talking about the same source that Christianity and what we'll call Hermeticism, the magical astrological practice, the same source that they have, and I can at least talk openly with them. I think that there's a it I feel very grateful that I can just be myself around them in that way. Um, there it took I think for them a little bit of getting used to, but I think for them, seeing that for me and also, my wife, that we practice these things and these approaches, these traditions, they create virtue, they create more ethical, compassionate, considerate people, ideally for the most part. Seeing it's a kind of like a proof is in the pudding sort of situation, that they feel like we've gotten to this point where we can more or less just agree to disagree about these kinds of things.
Hmm,
Yeah.
that's nice. Yeah, I've had some people who basically got disemboweled by their family, and then many years later, they kind of rekindle that relationship. But it's always nice to know that it doesn't always
Yeah.
have to be that way.
It doesn't always have to be that way, and if you're listening to this and you're on the fence, you're about kind of coming out of the magical closet, as it were, to your family, know that, it might not, it might not they may still be welcoming you in. They may not want to disown you. It's tricky because there's people who practice magic and astrology are explicitly damned within the New Testament. Paul's very explicit about that. But hopefully, if your family are doing the work, then they will see the goodness within you, and they won't just disown you just because you have these differences in basically worldview. It's just differences in dogma
Mm.
for the most part, which I think for me at least, being super Capricornian, I don't really I think dogma and worldview is perhaps one of the least important components of a religious life. It's much more important. There's much more important to me is the practice and the way that it's changing you. But nowadays, people like whole families will split, communities will split, churches will split over differences in just opinion about dogma and worldview and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, religion and politics are the two most taboo
Yes.
subjects we have right now.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
And so with that, you mentioned you do classical astrology. What are the
Mhm.
different types and why choose one over another?
So I think that there's two broad camps of astrology within the Western tradition. There's modern and traditional. Uh, and then classical is like a subsect of the traditional. Traditional includes like from like medieval astrology, Arabic astrology, basically anything that's not modern. And then classical or Hellenistic astrology is another word for it, is mostly rooted within Greco-Egyptian texts and Greco-Egyptian techniques. Um, the biggest now, so the modern approach, and this includes evolutionary, humanistic, Uranian astrology, their focus is more on psychology, and oftentimes kind of spiritual development might be blended into that in some way. A lot of it is discussing what is going on within the person, what's going on within that two by two square in the brain. And that's like a lot of modern astrology schools will really eschew any kind of prediction or any kind of concrete interpretations that you could make about people's lives. They just won't go in that direction with it. Classically, things like concrete prediction and concrete interpretations were the bread and butter of the astrologer. That's what they primarily did. There was a psychological element to it, but it's more or less just following the hermetic maxim, as within, so without. So if certain things are going to be happening outside of you, that's going to cause certain psychological disposition to happen within you, and vice versa. So this is I think this is that principle is very clear, especially when you look at the position, and I talk about this in my course Gnosis. You might remember the positions of the in the natal chart of the sun and the moon, and that how that influences and affects not just your own inner psychology, but also frequently the kind of father or mother that you had as well. And someone, for instance, with a fire sign moon, internally they're going to be more animated, agitative, talkative. They're going to have a lot more energy to do things. They're going to be more initiatory, more driven. But then conversely, oftentimes their home life and their environment growing up was very hectic, chaotic, frenetic. There were frequently many, many different things going on, many different things to keep track of. They're always running around, and oftentimes it was the mother that was frequently driving a lot of that active energy. And there's depending on the sign placement of the moon, like which of the fire signs, you can get even more specific about what kind of mother the individual had, but that person gets those psychological traits because of the upbringing and the home life they had. In other words, as within, so without. And I think that what I tell people is that classical astrology, traditional astrology is psychology and then so much more. It situates and it contextualizes psychological astrology and temperament and interpreting people's personalities within the greater context of the events that have happened to them and then the events that will be happening to them down the road. I've got a Capricorn stellium in my own chart. I am very interested in practicality and things being concrete. This is just my approach. I've always been interested in getting things as I like to get as detailed and as accurate in my understanding of like concrete events as I possibly can. And I just find that to be very, very useful for a spiritual practice. You know, if you know what kind of ride you have signed up to experience in life, if you know the general trend trajectory that your life is going to take, then people tend to relax a lot more. They stop fighting their fate. They know what kind of person they're going to become. And it is easier to choose spiritual practices, and in some cases, like a whole spiritual path that is more in alignment with that. Um, it's a again, if you know the kind of ride you've signed up for, then it's a lot easier to just relax and surrender and just do your spiritual practices and grow in power and awareness and become a better kind of person.
And so they're not necessarily locked into this is what your life is going to be like no matter what. But do you consider it kind of also a guide of, yeah, it might end up being like this, but there's ways to circumvent it?
I think of it in terms of a general trajectory.
Okay.
For the most part, there's some things that like will happen, and there's an event that happens, and there's not necessarily much that you can do to avoid the event happening to you. But in for many things, there's if you think of it more as the destination that you're going towards, what's your final outcome? And within the context of that destination and approaching that destination, there are some things that you can do that will make the journey better, and some things that will make it more challenging. So it comes to me, it comes back to flourishing. So if it's your destiny to become, a certain kind of flower, can you flourish with that destiny, or can you fight it unconsciously or consciously, and make it more difficult for you as a result? A really silly example: I'm 5'9". I will never be a linebacker. It will never happen. That is not my destiny. It's not in the cards for me. If I was so desperately wanting to try to be somebody who, or be a linebacker hypothetically, or want to be somebody that I can't be somebody that I'm not because I'm chasing after something, and I look at my chart and I see what's actually being prioritized and say, okay, I can tune in with what actually matters. I can let go of some things that aren't actually in alignment, aren't actually in integrity, and I can just get on board with, on the deepest level, what my spirit has already decided to do by incarnating here.
Hmm, that's
So
good.
a roundabout way of saying that I do believe in some wiggle room. I don't think that every single second of our life is fated, down to, every single time I, breathe, inhale and exhale. But but there's definitely I think it more as like a track that we're all on.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess with that, so I just want to ask the question because I always see this online. Like, how important do you feel the retrograde process really is for people? Because every time it's like, oh, everything's going wrong. Mercury's in retrograde. Oh, this is happening. My Venus is in retrograde or whatever. Like, is it?
Mhm, mhm.
I don't honestly don't think a lot of those people understand it fully, but
Yeah.
maybe some do, some don't. But how important are those type of things for people in general?
Like the retrograde transits, oftentimes they can show up very, very clearly. Um, they can be important. But it will change depending on how specifically it is affecting your own chart. So, for instance, if you got Mercury retrograding, well, what sign is he retrograding in? What house is that going over in your own natal chart? If is going to be the case for me with the upcoming Mercury retrograde. It's just going to be starting out in my first house in Aries and then moving into Pisces. Then when it moves into Pisces, probably won't I won't feel it as much because that is what we call a cadent house for me. So, and cadent houses are the 12th, ninth, 6th, and 3rd. And when planets move into that house for you, it's like the volume gets turned down on them. It gets a little bit quieter. Uh, but I can think of another instance where Mercury stationed retrograde within a very close aspect to major points in my chart around career. And I traveled across the country to meet with some business affiliates. And then when I traveled there, there was a communication mix up and they were not there when I had gone to travel with them. And that was specifically just as Mercury was stationing retrograde, which is one of the worst parts of a retrograde are the stations at the beginning and the end. So sometimes they can show up very, very clearly, and it's a very, very clear one-to-one thing that happens. There's another time Mercury started stationing direct. My phone just randomly fell out of my hand and cracked on the sidewalk. It just these things they just happen, and it felt like Mercury is sort of Parthian shot at that point. So he's like getting his last little dig in. Um, but sometimes people do say things online, and they don't, and what they're saying is like X is causing Y, and really X has nothing to do with Y, and you need a deeper understanding of the symbolism. So somebody say like, I'm so angry all the time. I'm such a Libra. Like, well, those have nothing to do with each other. That's not really a Libran thing. I saw that on Instagram.
Mhm.
And so before you jump to those kinds of conclusions, it is really, really useful to actually understand what the symbolism means so you don't end up confusing yourself. Uh, there is a structure to astrology. Certain mean things mean certain things. It's not all just open to your interpretation. It's not all just coming down to your own opinion and whatever you feel is true in the moment. There is a very clear structure to it, and you before you start making very, very uh, kind of like decisive conclusions about something in your chart, it's good to really have some kind of education. Of course, I'm biased. I think going into traditional source texts is always the way to go. Um, but you could start your practice wherever works for you. Um, yeah, and to really, in general, just go to sources on the internet who know what they're talking about. Go to podcasts with people who know what they're talking about. Of course, Chris Brennan's podcast is really good for astrology. I'm sure you're familiar with the astrology podcast. The work that they do is great. Kelly Surtees, Adam Ellenboss is my former teacher, and of course, my wife and I have a podcast too. But it's make sure that we're studying under people who absolutely know what they're talking about, and always be open to grow with your interpretations too. Always be open to being wrong.
Yep. That's good advice too, because it's easy nowadays to just go on Facebook or just go on the internet. Like when I was in the military, when someone got in trouble, we always called these people barracks lawyers because they would just Google things and then they would tell you,
Yep.
"Oh no, no, all you got to do is say this and you'll get out of everything." And it's like, yeah, where'd you get that information?
Yeah, yeah. It's the downside of like the democratization of knowledge that has happened through the internet is that it makes everybody feel like they're an expert or they could be an expert when that's not the case.
Yeah,
Um, Yeah, there's it's the same thing, like, somebody, has somebody, like, tweaks something in their hip, and then everybody around them says, like, "Oh, this is because of this. You have sciatica," or, like, something, or, like, "You've sprained this," or you always, always take advice from people who actually know what they're talking about. Don't just trust that anybody who sounds like they know what they're talking about is actually going to know what they're talking about, and always double check whatever it is that you're learning from, a friend or something in your life who doesn't actually study astrology with somebody who's, put the time in.
yeah. Again, very good advice. And with that, you mentioned like your business trip, traveling across country. Those people weren't there. Do you try to look ahead at your forecast before planning stuff like that, or do you just kinda see how it goes? Because I know some people will they'll do a chart based upon a question they might have. Is this a good time to start this business, or is this a good time to try to get pregnant? And then they'll try to pull up charts to see whether or not everything aligns for that. Do you kind of do the same thing with big life decisions?
I do as much as I'm able. Yes, I do. And this ties back into what I said earlier, where sometimes uh we can't we there's certain things that we kind of have to experience. Sometimes it feels like the universe kind of forces our hand with things. And so we were talking about before we started recording, I'm in the midst of, finalizing a USDA loan. And now, just with the way that things are going, it looks like we're probably going to end up signing the contract during a Mercury retrograde and a Venus retrograde. But in the next couple weeks. But we've been working at this for over a year. I'm not about to wait 6 weeks so that I can start building just when it's out of Venus retrograde. There's certain thing. Sometimes it feels like the universe just sort of forces your hand. Um, I always tell people when I'm teaching, like, preparing your life based off of transits and that kind of thing, what's known as elections and electional astrology. When I'm teaching people electional astrology, I always tell them you have a window to work with. The universe is going to give you a window of time in which to do something. Find the best possible window, find the best possible moment to do it within that time. Don't delay everything in your life, always waiting for the perfect opportunity. Those will frequently not come. There's nothing that's ever really completely perfect. um, you just do the best that you can with the options that you have. And this ties back into, the general trajectory being set for our lives. But there's this wiggle room that we have to really flourish and thrive within that. If we bring in mindfulness and if we use our tools and we bring our awareness to our practice, that we can make it a lot better, doing the best that we can with what we're given.
No, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, you could be trying to start a business, for example, but there's 5 or 6 steps you need to take. And so if you wait
Yeah.
those 5 or 6 steps, you're not going to be able to get the completion on the perfect date, for example, or maybe you're supposed to actually start it on the perfect date. So that's where I start getting in the headspace of, what should I do? Should I complete on this date? Should I start on this date? And then at that point, you're just becoming stuck because you're just worried
Yeah.
about getting it right.
Yeah, it can be a real trap for people who already struggle with things like analysis paralysis and decision paralysis. It can be they can You could always find a reason not to do something. And so for people who are always looking for reasons not to do things because they like being frozen in place, that can just become an additional contributing factor to keep people stuck. Um, and it might be a little bit easier for me. I mentioned I'm an Aries rising, so kind of like fast acting decisions not all as challenging for me. It's easier for me to just think of, I have to do this thing within a certain amount of time, find the best time within that context, and then just move forward, make it happen. And I know that I have to act then. I can't stay stuck because that's the time that I've got to move forward on this.
And with that philosophy, moving forward on, because I was looking at your website and stuff, and you also do talismans. So I'm assuming with
Yeah.
talismans, you want to make sure it's exactly right at the exact
Oh,
moment
yeah. Yeah.
because you're
Yeah.
bringing in those energies from the planets and you're infusing it into whatever object you're doing.
Mhm.
What is your process with that? Because I always find talismans
So I've
interesting.
Yeah, so with talismans specifically, there's a very set list of criteria that you're supposed to follow in order to effectively bring the energy, the spirits from the heavens above, from the upper world, into this world. Think of it as, based off of how the planets above us are moving, there are different portals that open in the sky at certain times. And electional astrology and talismanic astrology, 90% of that is knowing when those portals are going to be there. Uh, and sometimes or like how open they're going to be. There's a certain level of gradient to it. Um, I've was very, very strict with the talismans that I made, with the times that I used. And recently, there hasn't been a time for any of the planets in the last couple years that, in my opinion, has been good enough that was worth me selling them.
Mhm.
So I haven't made talismans for the last couple years because of that. This year, though, later there will be more Jupiter talismans with Jupiter moving into his exaltation in Cancer. But there's a couple universals. So for one, the planet needs to be essentially dignified in some way. So the planet needs to be in a sign that is comfortable for it. So, for instance, Jupiter is very comfortable in the sign of Pisces, of or well Pisces too, but Cancer, where he's going to be moving into in June in a couple months, and so you could make talismans to Jupiter then. Um, uh, on the other hand, Jupiter is very uncomfortable in the sign of Gemini, where he is currently. And you see, this historically has been one of the worst years for small business. Jupiter rules abundance and expansion and growth. And when Jupiter is debilitated in some way, businesses tend to falter, they tend to not do well. And so this has been a very, very difficult period economically for people when Jupiter has been in Gemini. And that started in June of last year, June of 2024. But I do think that moving forward into the second half of 2025 with Jupiter in Cancer, things will improve. But that's a better time for making a talisman. And then you need to make sure that the planet isn't forming any hard aspects to the malefics, Mars or Saturn, or at least not applying. I won't get into the details of that. And then another big thing to consider is that the planet is actually in an angular house when you're making your talisman. So basically, by one of the horizons, east or west, and then at the very top of the sky or at the very bottom. And going back into being able to feel the energy rise and fall, like you were talking about earlier with when you were in a Christian ceremony, the I remember one time I was making talismans and I had the election set up for when Jupiter was angular in the 10th house. So the idea is that like those are the pivot points. That's where the energy comes in most naturally. And everything else was good. Jupiter was essentially dignified. There was a good aspect to the moon. Malefics weren't getting in the way at all. And I was making the talismans. I could feel the energy coming down. And then the moment that Jupiter moved out of the angular house and into a cadent house, the energy was just gone. I could still feel that Jupiter up there was nice and happy, but it was like the portal had closed right when Jupiter moved into a cadent house. And it was very, very tangible. And so I stopped making talismans, and the one or two that I made after it had closed, I didn't sell because they didn't have the juice. And, again, this is why to do this kind of work, it's really important to have a consistent spiritual practice. You really need to be able to feel this stuff effectively. It's not just about following rules from a book. You really got to feel the magic, and it's you always kind of follow the energy in that way too. Like listen to what's going on with the magic around you.
Mhm. And so would you change any of that if you were just making a talisman for you personally? So for me, for example, I have Gemini sun. So
Mhm.
I was always told when Jupiter hit Gemini, it was going to be a good year for me because I'm a Gemini. So I don't know
Right.
if it
Yeah.
changes how I would make a talisman if I wanted to do a Jupiter talisman or a Jupiter ritual.
It's a good question. It's not one that I have an exact answer to.
Okay.
I don't know if I would ever. I do think that it has an effect on people personally. I've seen for the readings that I've done for people with Gemini placements in their chart, I've seen that at first things weren't going super well with Jupiter and Gemini for them, but then maybe in the last couple months or so, after it took a little bit of time, but then things started to open up a little bit more and more opportunities started to arise. That's what you see when a planet is a good planet like Jupiter is debilitated, but moving over a positive point that there's more legwork involved to get to the good fortune that the planet will give you. Um, but I don't know if I could ever In theory, yes. You make a talisman with Jupiter directly over your sun by a degree, then that will affect you very, very closely. But it's something that I need to experiment with,
Hmm.
and maybe I wouldn't sell them at the same price or something like
Right.
that. Um, yeah,
I figure there'd be
that would be my thought.
more work involved because you'd have to individualize them with each client per se that you're working with for that specific talisman.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'd wonder even I could say, okay, so they've got a Gemini sun, but I might just pick another one of the air signs to get the trine, or I would wait until Jupiter was in his own bounds in Gemini. So these are divisions of the signs that are associated with each of the planets. And so I think of these as like if the signs of the zodiac are like a house, then these bounds are like rooms in the houses, and each planet has a room. And so if Jupiter's in his own bounds in Gemini, then I could say, all right, he's not in a house that he likes, but at least he's in his own room. Maybe it's a little bit stronger. And what I would want to do is make talismans like that and experiment for a couple years even and see, well, how does this actually affect people? Does somebody with a Gemini stellium take better to a Jupiter and Gemini talisman, or is, say, a Jupiter and Pisces talisman or a Jupiter and Sag talisman still better for them anyway?
Interesting. And then the one thing I wanted to talk about too is we talked about it before we started recording. I've had a couple of people on. We've talked about different prophecies. Even I had a guy on I just recorded with last week. He does human design, and human
Hmm.
design also mixes astrology and the I Ching and some other stuff together. And everyone basically, from indigenous prophecies to human design to what little bit I know of astrology, is that this is like a major time right now, like a turning point, if you will. Things are shifting and moving. And I'm curious what your perspective is on that being, more astrologically minded.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, it is a big time. What I tell people is that the most important astrological transit of your life already happened. It was the Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius at the end of 2020. And this, of course, was simultaneous with COVID, very, very closely related to that. Um, the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions happen once every 20 years. They're major milestones in what we call mundane astrology. They give you the general sense for what the next 20 years are going to be like. When Saturn is stronger, it's a little bit more challenging. When Jupiter is stronger, it's better. This was one where Saturn was very, very strong and Jupiter was not strong at all. So, it'll be an interesting 20 years for sure. But this wasn't just a Jupiter Saturn conjunction, this was a triplicity shift. Um, so these only occur every 240 years. Um, the Jupiter Saturn conjunction will happen in always in the same element. So it was previously in Earth signs, but every time the conjunction happens, it will move forward by 2.5 degrees. Uh, until it's so it's always in an Earth sign, always kind of moving further along in the sign every time the conjunction happens. And then after 240 years go by, the next conjunction will occur in the next element. So we had 240 years in Earth signs, and this corresponds with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and a serious um, kind of calcification of empire that we've seen where these sort of super states have just gotten way too stable on a geopolitical angle and this intense stratification of wealth that is continuing to happen. And all got started, around 240 years ago, and, read like 1780, and, it was really when things got started. And now, it's moved into air signs. So what's going to happen? The easiest thing to do is to just extrapolate from the past, see what happened before. And we went through the same cycle in, the transition from the High Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It was the exact same tradition down to the signs. It was the same sequence of signs where you had a conjunction in Libra, then a conjunction in Taurus, then the Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. We had the same thing going on here. where we had the Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Libra in 1980, and then Taurus in 2000, and then Aquarius in 2020. So what happened then? Just look at what happened then. So you saw it was the same situation. There was a major stratification of class that was happening that time, a serious wealth instability with the High Middle Ages, with feudalism, with serfdom, um, and also a lot of global strife and global wars during that period with the beginning of the Crusades, and also a lot of things going on at that time. But it was in the following 240 years that a lot of that stuff started to collapse. For the first time, you saw the emergence of a middle class in Europe, and the lords and peasants social contract was replaced by, or there were other classes in between that, and there was but of course also there was the Black Plague, the Black Death, which was a big part of that. It was potentially half of Europe was wiped out during that period, at most, and it wasn't just one in three people. It would be whole villages that would just, if it got into a village, the village was done. And it's interesting. It's interesting that that Black Plague happened shortly after another Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius in 1345, where then Mars was very, very closely involved. Which, if you rewind back to March of 2020, you saw the same thing. It was a Jupiter Saturn conjunction with Mars there in the same sign of Aquarius. And the last time that happened was right before the Black Plague. And people back then, scholars back then in the church, were blaming the Black Plague on that Jupiter Saturn Mars conjunction. They were saying that this was the indicator that this was going to be coming down. And so we saw the exact same thing here. We saw a major pandemic happening around that time. And so I'm expecting that throughout the next 240 years that we see, sometime in there, perhaps in another conjunction in Aquarius later on, there'll be another plague potentially. I think that there will be. I do think that things for the next 100 years or so are going to get increasingly volatile. Um, it was shortly after the Jupiter Saturn the triplicity shift into air signs that you saw the another major instance of stratification and established power getting wiped out, where the Mongol hordes, about 40, 60 years after the triplicity shift, swept through the vast majority of Asia and China, Russia, the Islamic world, and ended the established power structures there. Like, just utterly ended it. You had saw major empires just that had a pretty strong hold on power just collapse within several decades, and so that was a devastating loss of life. There were lots of major problems that came out with that. Of course, we lost the great library within Baghdad. That was this was like this mecca, mecca of learning, and but there was a lot of social equality that came out of it in the long run. And it did lead to the Renaissance, and it led to a lot more, equality within it, in terms of the amount of wealth that people had. And there was a kind of, it did sort of level the playing field. So I think that, we can expect similar things to happen. There will be some pretty intense moments, I think, within the next century that, like other, things like the Golden Horde going across all of Asia and into the end, onto the edges of Europe, and really destabilizing a lot of governments, and a lot of instability coming about. But I think in the long run, it will be a good thing.
Hmm.
I think you'll see more. I think you'll see something like another Renaissance. I think you'll see a much easier access to knowledge and much greater interest in learning, and probably a return to ancient source texts, just like you saw back then with the Renaissance. That's what the Renaissance was, and I think that the big fear that people have of the disappearing middle class, while that's I think is a very, very real fear now, I think that 100 years from now, we'll see something like that returning. I think that a lot of the wealth gaps that we see currently will start to balance back out again. Those are the 2 big things that I see. It's a very, very pivotal moment that we're at right now. Again, this is the most important transit of people's lives, is that Saturn conjunction. And most people don't ever see one in their life. It's only every 240 years. Um, that's gonna be pretty unstable for a good while, but in the long run, I think it will be very, very positive.
Yeah, that's kind of what a lot of others have said too, is we just kinda have to go through the crap right now to get out to the other side, and I never heard about the Renaissance being around the same time as all that too, and that kinda makes sense with some of the indigenous prophecies where they're talking about bringing back the old ways and still
Yeah.
utilizing technology, but getting more into that heart space and using the technology for good and working together with it, not just, you know, destroying the earth and, wiping everything out, but finding that balance between the 2. So that's an interesting take on it too.
Yeah, I think, the big question is, we can't go back,
Mm,
right? We can't, Pandora's box has been opened, you can't unring the bell. But how can we bring the technology that we do have, how can we use it better? Um, how can we integrate it with the earth in some way? And I don't think that was exactly a question that they were asking per se during the Renaissance. They weren't as the destruction of the earth was not as extreme, um, but it was something that did kind of happen. You saw this reintegration of what people had developed with, like, bringing back ancient wisdom, and that's what I think, within the next 100 years, there's going to be a huge resurgence of people who wanna go back to the source, and, um I think that out of the ashes of a lot of, experiences that really destabilize, power structures, there will be an opportunity for more equality to come about.
agreed. Yeah, and well, I follow, Gordon White as well from Rune Soup,
Yeah,
and one thing he talks about too is this will pass. This is going to pass, and we just can't live in fear of it. We just do do what makes you happy so that if you do die tomorrow, that you're okay with it. It's
yeah,
we just have to live our lives. We have to be happy with what our choice is, and we just do what makes us happy, and just live basically is the best way I tell people too is if you die tomorrow, are you okay with the way you've been living? And if not, maybe there's something there for you to look at.
yeah. Then you should change something. Figure out what you could be doing that's better or, like, in more in alignment. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that, I mean, that we're all just living one of many lifetimes that we've had, and at least within the Hermetic tradition, our real home is in the stars. We're here, having an experience, going on a journey, learning things. I think being of service too is a big part of it, helping each other out, helping the earth, caring for the earth. But this, like, as Gordon White said, "This too shall pass." This is not permanent, and whatever happens to you here is not going to affect your eternal soul. Um, there's things that are, there's aspects to you and aspects to your psyche that far transcend whatever drama might be happening here in the moment.
Definitely agree. With that, before we start wrapping up, though, do you have any advice? You kind of touched on it already, but any advice for people who are just starting out, maybe lost and confused, maybe they're interested in astrology? Where can they go? What books maybe they should look at? I know you also offer courses. Now,
Mhm.
we can talk about those too as well.
Sure. I think, for people who are just starting out, I would say find a simple, consistent meditation practice to do and do it every single day. If you're interested in experiencing firsthand what this beautiful world of spirituality has to offer you, you need to have a consistent practice that you do to open yourself up to it. And in addition to giving you more awareness, more power, more spiritual power, and more insight, it will also make your life a lot more enjoyable and more and easier too. It makes things it reduces stress, reduces anxiety, and don't get too caught up in the weeds of trying to find the right thing. It can be as simple as just going outside and closing your eyes and just watching your breath for 20 minutes and feeling your body just relax and connecting with the energy of the earth. Um, for people who are interested in astrology, I mentioned some good podcasts earlier for free. My wife and I have a podcast too that you can see links to on my website, ancientastrology.com. And my wife and I run a membership community called the School of Heaven and Earth, where we teach astrology in tandem with ritual magic and herbalism and these other grounded, concrete spiritual practices where you can really learn how to understand the meanings of the planets and the stars and the signs of the zodiac within a more embodied, practical context that you might find anywhere else. You can find links to that on my website too, Ancient Astrology, and we keep the price for that pretty low. It's just $20 a month, and there's tons of lessons there, and there's live sessions, and there's a backlog of recordings that you can watch, and you would be able to just go to town, just learning whatever it is that you want. And we've set it up so that we offer things that we consider foundational and central to wherever else you may go. So even if you come in and you stay for a couple months and you say, I feel myself being called towards a different tradition, maybe, yoga or Zen. We know that the things that you learn within the School of Heaven and Earth, they're so universally applicable that they will just help you wherever they go. Everything from like just foundational principles of meditation and spiritual practice to practical things like the use of different herbs, whether just medically or within the use of or in the context of ritual and connecting with plants.
Yeah, we'll be linking all that too on the show notes for people, so I'll make sure they have access, so not just the website, but I'll put everything in there as well.
Awesome. Yeah.
The way they have it. But yeah, it's I was in the membership program when it first started after that round
Mhm.
of Gnosis class I took. And it was good. I was there for a while and then it was my calling shifted me. So I had to break off and go do something different. But I might be
Yeah.
coming back because I feel like astrology is calling me back. So I need to kind of like playing with that now and trying to figure out, get out of my head with it and just, work with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Gemini roadblock. Like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Don't get too tripped up trying to get it just right. Just do have fun with it, even to a certain extent. But yeah, I mean, we'd love to have you back. We've implemented a lot of new stuff. Just in the last recent months, we started doing monthly challenges where we add like a simple practice people can do just to connect with the energy of that zodiacal season. So right now we're having people do a brief journey with their guides, their spirit guides, in the morning when they wake up and in the evening before they go to bed to help get guidance on a particular thing that's been like a stumbling block for them or they've had trouble with and trying to really get clarity on it during this Pisces season. And we're all doing it together. And so I teach a live class where I introduce the challenge once a month, and then my wife Crystal teaches two classes, one for the new moon and the full moon, where we do journeys with different plant medicines and plant allies. And then I give this every month a ritual elections calendar for good times for working with the planets. And then yeah, a lot more on top of that,
Nice.
like the lessons and so on.
I guess my last question I want to follow up is throughout your journey, like what is the most, I guess, inspirational thing you've seen either with yourself or with clients by using astrology?
Mm. I think I'm always impressed by the capacity for astrology to get to the root issues of problems. So whether those are medical problems or emotional spiritual problems. Um, there's certain things that you look at, especially related to Saturn and Mars, that tell you where the triggers are, where the problems are. In many cases, where the physical ailments are too. And in this, great, beautiful, but also frustrating, confusing tapestry that is the interconnectedness of the human experience, where everything's kind of playing in, and it's hard to get to the bottom of things sometimes. Astrology is very, very, very useful as a diagnostic tool in saying, like, this is it. This is the sensitive point. These are the wounds. These are the struggles. These are the obstacles. And it's instead of kind of beating around the bush or darting around it or maybe approaching it but not being sure, it just helps you very, very clearly to say, "This is what I've gotta be working on. This is what I've gotta be focusing on. This is where the trauma is," and just move forward with that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never done that deep of a dive on my chart. I've pulled it up and I've looked at it, but I've never gone that deep with it. So that's something to take into. And I guess that brings up another question because I know for myself, I had the wrong birth time for the longest time.
Okay.
And it wasn't
Okay.
until a
Yeah.
couple years ago when I went home, with my dad's death and clearing things out, I found my real birth certificate that had the real time, and that actually shifted everything. Because before I was a Gemini sun, Gemini rising, Scorpion moon. Once I got the real time, it was a Gemini sun, Capricorn rising, and then a
Ah,
Scorpion moon, and everything was like different. And so I guess
yeah.
what's the recommendation for people who might not have the exact time? What's a good way of getting a decent chart?
Well, you can meet with an astrologer and do something called a rectification, and they'll, you know, based off of a particular window that you have when you were born, even a full day, basically determine the correct rising sign and move forward from there. I've done rectifications for people. Um, I always find it's kind of clear, especially I use something called whole sign houses, where every single time you shift the rising sign, all of the house positions will shift over by one. And so for me, it's always pretty cut and dry. If the choice is between even 4 or 5 different rising signs, which one it is based off of the houses that are being occupied, in particular by the sun and the moon. Um, so you just kinda you play around with it and you look and you see, I'll especially look at different transits and see what kinds of things happened during different transits in people's lives, which houses were activated, and that generally gives you a pretty clear picture.
Okay.
Yep.
Good advice too. Yeah, because I know, like, even my wife, for the longest time, we didn't even have a birth time until we just recently got her true birth certificate. And it's just that back and
Right.
forth of, well, this doesn't feel right, but this does. And then you get stuck in the head of, well, am I even doing this right? Because you're trying to go online. There's tons of places where you can get free charts online, but then you have to
Yep.
try to figure out what it all means.
Yeah, and I think it's easy when you have a guide, who can especially show you how to do it step by step, piece by piece, then it can be easier to figure out how to do it, for yourself, and then for other people if you get really into it. But, without that, it's gonna be so difficult, and then they give, like, those computer-generated interpretations oftentimes, and then they don't really resonate, and, people have trouble knowing where to start with it, and they just get really, really frustrated. It's helpful to find a guide. I am, of course, partial to the classical approach. There's lots of classical astrologers out there. I do readings too. I'd be happy to do a reading for anybody listening to this that wants one. And yeah, it's helpful to meet with somebody who has already read over 1,000
Hmm,
charts. Yeah,
agreed.
makes it a lot easier. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate your time, man. This has been a lot of fun. Is there anything else you would want to put out there for anyone to know? Or again, we'll put the link to your podcast website, your program, all that on there. But if there's anything else you want people to know about you or what you do, just take a few minutes.
Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered it, Jeremy. Yeah, I'd say, I get my heart always goes out to people who really want to experience the magic. And if that's the camp that you find yourself in, just like, get out there and start doing consistent spiritual practices. It's as you're just starting out, it's not as important what exactly you're doing. Just find something that feels right and move forward in that direction. And either that will either be it, or it will open you up to what you're exactly actually supposed to be doing. And so just move forward with something. You owe it to yourself to do things that will open you up to have the kinds of experiences that you want. All of the magic that you've read about and dreamt about is very real. All the spirits are real. The spirits of the heavens, the local nature spirits, the fae, the underworld spirits, they're all there. Even many cases waiting to help you out. They just need you to open the door and ask for help. And the all the auras, the chakras, you can experience them all yourself. It just takes consistent practice and making it happen. So that's what I would say to my pep talk to drive you forward to do the thing that will get you what you want.
Agreed. No, that's good advice. And yeah, it's just because you try one thing doesn't mean, and you don't like it, that's fine. Try something else, and then
Yeah.
maybe you'll come back to it. Again, I tried astrology for a little bit. It wasn't the right time for me at that moment because I was really in depth with shamanism and some other chaos magic type stuff. But it was
Right. Yeah.
interesting to pick up, and it's been showing up in other ways in different formats. Like I
Yeah.
said, the human design guy I talked to, astrology is a part of that. Like astrology is
Mhm.
it's in a lot of things, shamanism too, like you mentioned earlier. So
Yeah.
you don't necessarily need to fully understand it to appreciate it. And if you want to get into that pick a tricks and ritual magic, there's a lot of working with the planets too. And I've done some Jupiter magic where you're pulling in Jupiter, you're working with Mercury, and
Mhm.
timing's the right time of the day and all that stuff too. So just knowing a little bit about it is also helpful.
For sure. You being conversational in it and, yeah, I mean, whatever you do, it will help you in some way, and, the worst that it will do is help get you where you're supposed to be going next, and, like, so, most important is just that you just start with something.
Perfect. All right, again, man, I appreciate your time and I hope people reach out to you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks again for having me on, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Shaman Stories podcast. If you have any interest in the services that I provide or the services of my guest, please click the link in the show notes below. Thank you. And until next time, have a good journey.